Hello, and welcome to the African Energy Podcast. My name is Dan Marks. I'm the power editor of African Energy, and I'm here with James Gavin, the hydrocarbons editor, and Ajay Ubhi, who is a senior research analyst with African Energy. So we are talking about the latest issue of African Energy, which was released earlier today, issue 441. It's another bumper issue and leads with a large package on Ethiopia, where we're looking in a lot of detail at the conflict in Tigray and in particular the impact of US sanctions on the country. So this issue has been going on since November, at least in Tigray. There's a lot of security dimensions which we cover in a lot of detail in the article, but from an energy sector perspective, the real changes started to come with the United States sanctions, which were brought in late last month. In the announcement, it was easy to kind of miss the impact that these might have. They focused a lot on visa restrictions, targeted visa restrictions at certain officials and military officials and certain military groups, but underneath was economic sanctions, which are having a very direct effect with US aid and USDFC, United States International Development Finance Corporation, having to pull out, and this having really direct impact on certain projects. For example, Tullow, a large geothermal project that's been in the works for getting on for 10 years, perhaps more than 10 years, where DFC has had to leave the lender group. So there's direct consequence, and then indirect consequences are investors starting to look at whether other donors will also follow suit. Could potentially be a collapse of projects is the concern, and similarly whether investors themselves should continue to be involved. As kind of more reports of atrocities. Certainly things like the weaponization of famine. When people start to talk about that, and investors start to worry about whether they should be involved in the country at all, and there are concerns as to what happens if reputable investors, the long-term investors, and development finance institutions start to pull out, and there's a collapse of these projects, and you start to get less reputable companies moving in, and what this could mean for the reform agenda, which, although has been moving very slowly under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who promised a lot in 2018, has been moving, and there's been some progress, in particular geothermal projects. There's been some progress, but the long-term issues remain. There's still a huge issue over tariffs, which remain far too low. A lot of pressure on IPPs to bring down their costs to very unreasonably low levels, and levels where projects simply can't be financed, to geothermal projects below 5 cents per kilowatt hour, solar projects extremely low, but without currency guarantees on convertibility, currency remaining a huge issue. So the reform agenda has got some way, and there have been procurement programs. There's been progress on the arbitration agenda, but there's a lot that remains to be done before these projects can actually reach financial close, and this conflict only makes that harder to achieve. So we look at that in a lot of detail. There's a lot of concern, and I think the next 6 months are seen as critical for the country. Elsewhere in the power section, we have some small but very significant announcements. Pre-qualification has begun in Côte d'Ivoire for 2 solar PV projects under Scaling Solar with combined capacity of 60 megawatts. So quite exciting things happening there. Construction beginning at the Kawamba solar PV and battery plant in Mozambique. More problems in Zambia again. That's ongoing, and also some a look at off-grid projects in Egypt. But the larger part of the publication, again, is looking at gas, and this following on from our partner organization, African Investment Exchange's gas event on Wednesday. which looked a lot at the future of gas and the role of gas in the energy transition. And we have Ajay here to talk a little bit about that. So you were at the event, Ajay. You've written a bit about it and the impact in particular on Algeria of this kind of process. So how do you see the issues facing gas in terms of its future, its long-term future, and whether investors should be concerned about investing in gas over a 20-year period now?
Yeah, so really, I think the main theme of the conference that we had on Wednesday was really this idea that we all in the industry, the upstream operators, the downstream operators, and everyone else in between, really we understand that gas is going to be the transition fuel for Africa, and it really does need to be the transition fuel rather than looking at renewables with batteries or any other kind of storage that might be down the pipeline. And really this idea that Africa has, in terms of its CO2 emissions and its actual CO2 footprint, is relatively minuscule compared to the rest of the world. If you look at the latest figures from the IEA, something like 1.2 billion tons of CO2 is being emitted in Africa compared to somewhere like China, which is 9.5 billion tons. So the difference between China and between Africa and everywhere else is quite stark, really. So this idea that the energy transition will place certain obligations on Africa in terms of these developing economies to move in the same direction as other developed nations in their own energy transitions, and to move along the same line, doesn't really make sense for an African context. And so one of the key things that came out from the panels was that Africa needs its own policies, it needs its own plans and projects in place that make sense within an African context. And really, this is going to be with a gas focus. You've got large proven reserves in Mozambique, which are hopefully to be brought online in the next few years, which is looking to have a fairly huge impact on Mozambique itself. The security concerns notwithstanding, obviously. So you have these resources across the continent. So you have West Africa as well with Senegal. Obviously Nigeria has a significant amount of gas. Algeria as well. And so really the focus for a lot of the panelists was looking at how these governments can use their own resources in a sustainable way, and how they can use gas to transition towards a more renewable future. But for the time frame that you mentioned, the 10, 15, 20-year time frame, gas is probably going to be the main fuel for those who can secure it.
And what do you? I thought it was interesting, the argument that was made that in Africa, unlike a lot of other parts of the world where the electricity sector is a major source of emissions, in Africa, the electricity sector is potentially a major source of emissions reductions, as emissions are quite often associated with deforestation, the use of charcoal for cooking and biomass for cooking, things like that was, I think, an interesting argument. But I mean, what do you make of the kind of stranded asset risk? And I think it was mentioned that gas power plants are very flexible, in the sense that you can use them in a variety of ways. They don't have to be baseload, they could be peaking, but also they can be used in a variety of fuels. Like for now, it might be natural gas. There are other types of gas, but equally later on, theoretically, you could have hydrogen type plants. But I mean, the risk that I wonder about is the contractual risk. You sign a 20-year contract now. You sign it on a mid-merit or high load factor basis. That's the basis on which you finance and price your project.
Exactly.
And 10, 15 years time, if batteries are a lot cheaper, you being used as a much lower load factor, you've got better interconnections, more kind of cheap renewables during the day, perhaps cheap hydropower. That potentially is a kind of contractual legal risk. I mean, how do you see that side of things?
No, you're absolutely right. One of the one of the other key things was this idea of flexibility. And like you said, it's not just within the technical running of the actual plant, but within the contractual terms of these power projects. And having these long-term PPAs where a lot of them are going to be 20, 25 years. You secure your fuel supply for your power plant, and like you said, 10, 15 years down the line, renewables comes in, solar, batteries, everything else, and suddenly your power plant is further down the merit order, and you're having to resort to securing perhaps other more expensive power from somewhere else. And so certainly the time frame within which we're talking in terms of the African energy transition, this 20-year period, some of the panelists weren't so concerned with that time frame in terms of using gas with the prospect of renewables coming further down the line. And again, flexibility was key here. The idea that you can source other fuels for your engines, and it's not just going to be running on LNG. You can use LPG, and like you said, hydrogen as well. So flexibility is certainly something that's going to be very important further down the line within the transition. So it's certainly something to be aware of. Yeah.
And you looked in a more specific case in one of your articles for this issue about kind of the impact of international attitudes to gas and to carbon being kind of having ramifications in Africa. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that in Algeria.
Yeah, so Algeria is obviously a highly productive gas producer and exporter, and one of the things that we were looking at was the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which they are hopefully going to be finalizing next month in July. But the mechanism itself probably won't come into effect within 2022, but there's even talk of it being, there's an interim period, and it may not even be implemented by, as late as 2030 even. But the issue that we were looking at is that this mechanism will effectively apply a carbon tax or tax to certain products based on their carbon content. And one of the things that Algeria has going against it really is that the amount of gas flaring in Algeria is substantially high. It's the highest in Africa, and the fifth largest in the world, with something like 9.3 BCM last year, according to the World Bank. And this is a fairly huge problem for them, considering that they export something like 35% of their total crude oil production to the EU. That's something like 364,000 barrels a day of oil. And so if this adjustment mechanism was to be brought in, that's a fairly substantial segment of their market which could be penalized. Now, there are some talks about exemptions for certain countries, but I think this is mostly going to be applying to the least developed nations. So Algeria probably wouldn't apply to that exemption. And so really it's going to be asking questions of Sonatrach. If you don't look at the upstream, if you're not going to stop gas flowing at site, if you can't find the commercial incentives to do it there, maybe look downstream at where your market is going to be 10 years from now, 15 years from now, as these EU markets, the North American markets, the Asian markets, as they look to restrict their exposure to carbon emissions in terms of what they're importing into their markets. For Sonatrach to look at that and maybe rethink the way that they're doing things, and maybe try and reduce their gas flowing, because at the moment it's a huge problem for them. And it's not just a huge problem in terms of potential taxes, it's a massive loss of revenue for them, which could, if used properly, form a renewable base for them. I mean, Algeria has a huge amount of solar and wind potential, and the revenue that they could secure from their gas flaring, from ending their gas flaring, monetizing this gas, could form a solid foundation for renewables in Algeria. They could copy Egypt, do a Benban solar park project in Algeria. So there are opportunities there for Algeria, and it's really a case for the government to show some commitment to doing that. At the moment, Sonatrach has they operate a large percentage of the gas flowing sites that you have in Algeria. So it's really down to Sonatrach to really come up with the right types of commercial contracts and the right fiscal terms that they can achieve with their operators, which hopefully will come through with the new hydrocarbon law. So there's certainly opportunities there for Algeria, and there's some signs of change there, but it really will need to ramp up fairly rapidly if they are to not fall foul of the EU's new rules.
I think it's interesting, really. We've got, on the one side, you've got people talking about the use of gas and power and whether you should be doing that, and then on the other side, as there's more awareness and more thought about the carbon intensity of the whole value chain for gas, from including the upstream, there's also more questions about where you source your gas from. Is your source of gas reducing its own emissions, not just you reducing your own emissions by using gas? That's quite interesting dynamic. So I think in the upstream, you've also been writing both in recent issues and this issue, James, about the impact of kind of energy transition and attitudes internationally on kind of oil majors in particular in Africa, and also now some new initiatives. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. And picking up some of the points Ajay was focusing on. In one of my articles, looking at Cameroon, Cameroon's a difficult place. There's a lot of red tape. It's never been the easiest place to do business, and those people who are there are pretty hardy. But it still seems for those who can monetize gas. I mean, I think Cameroon has really become a natural gas story as its crude sort of production declines. But so there's a prominent Australian origin company, Victoria Oil and Gas, whose local subsidiary Gaz de Cameroon is proving a success story there. They've managed to monetize gas by delivering it to local industrial players, and getting that company's thoughts on it. They were basically pointing out that it's just it's cheaper for those customers. They were initially importing a lot of diesel and heavy fuel oil and their equipment, which is all expensive. Liquid fuels cost more than twice the average price of natural gas. So even on that sort of, if you strip out all the transition and more favorable environmental aspects of natural gas, it's got a really strong commercial basis. You can see it on the ground there in Cameroon. And then one of the other big articles I was doing, an interview with Paul McDade, who's heading up a new enterprise called Afentra, which is really designed to sort of, again, play into that, a bit into that transition narrative. They're explicitly looking to pick up assets being left behind by the majors, which again, as Dan intimated, big theme of recent issues, and including this one. He told me that natural gas is where the future is for them as well. You know, it's just becoming more commercial for them. You know, as the West African gas market becomes more sophisticated, the commercial case just becomes that much more easy. So that's on the gas side. Looking at Afentra, very interesting. I mean, Paul McDade, a Scotsman, big experience in the North Sea, but also been very active in the West African and East African asset market from his days as CEO of Tullow, which we all know as a sort of long-standing player in large tracts of Africans upstream. So he left a couple of years ago. Was thinking of sort of, you know, going off presumably to play golf, but then with this trend of majors selling up in Africa, he sort of realised, hang on, there's a gap in the market there. There's while there are established independents who have long track records in Africa, he said his view is that this needs to be a specific new entity that's more attuned to the opportunity that's arising. So he flagged up him and one of his colleagues have long experience. They're sort of quite politically savvy. They know the politics of Africa. And he said to me, in a lot of global asset markets, you have a buyer and a seller, and that's just about it. He said in Africa, you have a buyer, seller, and the government, and they're all three integral parts of it. And so you need to have that understanding and that relationship with the host government, and that's part of his pitch. But the sort of, I guess the transition aspect in all this is, he's saying if you are going out to raise capital on the international capital market, if you're to raise money for various ventures or to acquire assets, you need to be very stringent on ESG. I mean, investors are looking very focused on your ESG profile. If you're not paying attention to that, you're not going to be able to raise money. So it's also quite it's part of the commercial case. You can't remove ESG from the wider picture there. So very, very interesting what they're planning. Well, we'll see what success they have. Certainly they've got the experience, and he was also making the point that for a lot of these upstream assets in Africa, you don't need the huge manpower, the huge headcount that the majors like to have, and perhaps which make those projects uneconomical or non-core for them. He said, you can run those with smaller teams, deploying indigenous resources. He very much spoke up the quality of some of the, for example, in Ghana. He said there's some real talent there on the ground that some of the smaller independent outfits can sort of make use of. Sorry.
Thinking a little bit about so for me as a power editor, the upstream is a bit less familiar. I mean, looking at the kind of higher level of the IOCs and them moving out of Africa, this opportunity that Paul McDade is looking to take advantage of. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how that kind of the transition thinking and the oil majors, trying to change, to adapt, is kind of resulting in them, leaving Africa, consolidating assets? What's the kind of thinking that's leading from one to the other?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say that what's the key? I mean, is the transition? I mean, in some ways you can question whether is the transition driving them to do this, to divest, or is it just the economics or the sort of organization? I think in a way it's both. If you're BP, which is perhaps the most prominent, Bernard Looney very much plays up at every opportunity that the way that BP is transitioning. It's an integrated energy company. It's not an IOC anymore, in the way they put it. But I guess the reality is these assets fundamentally are just not productive enough and too much of a burden. They're absorbing too much of their global corporate assets, and it just kind of seems to make sense to sell them off if they can, rather than persevere. So is that necessarily driven by the transition? Perhaps tangentially, but I'd say that perhaps the real driver is economic, is the commercial case. Interestingly, again, something we've written about in the last couple of issues, BP and Italy's Eni joining forces across parts of Africa, Angola and Algeria. They know each other well, and there's talk of formalizing joint venture, their operations into joint ventures, in-country joint ventures. So, but that possibly reflects the difficulty that BP is finding in selling on those assets. It's not an easy thing to do in the current climate, and therefore perhaps better to join forces, create synergies, cut costs by teaming up with another big local player in African markets like Angola. Yeah, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, certainly, Exxon is trying to sell midstream assets in Cameroon, including the pipeline, the Chad Cameroon pipeline. It's not just upstream; it's across the board. They are definitely heading for the exit door. And I know this is going on elsewhere. It's not just an Africa story either. It's parts of Southeast Asia, the likes of Repsol setting up big time there. So it is a global story, a global theme, if you will. But Africa is definitely at the forefront.
Very interesting. Great. Well, thanks a lot for joining us, James and Ajay, and thanks everybody for listening. And we look forward to doing this again in 2 weeks' time after the next issue.